The palace had always been a place of certainty. Its walls stood tall, untouched by doubt. Its gates opened only for those who were approved. And within it lived a king who believed he needed no one. But on this day, something was different. A man had entered, not a noble, not a warrior, not a man of influence, just a man. He carried no wealth, no title, no visible importance, yet somehow he had made his way through doors that were never meant for men like him. The air within the palace felt heavier, not because of his presence, but because of what it represented. A warning had arrived. The king sat upon his throne as he always did, still, certain, unmoved. He had ruled for many years, long enough to believe that experience had made him wise, long enough to believe that power had made him right. And so when the man entered, nothing within the king shifted, because a man who has stopped listening does not recognize the moment he should. The kingdom beyond the palace walls was changing, slowly, quietly, but undeniably. The fields had begun to weaken. What once grew easily now required effort. The rivers, once full and generous, had begun to shrink, not dramatically, not in a way that caused panic, but in a way that whispered, "Something is wrong." The people felt it first, not through announcements, but through absence. Less food, less water, less certainty. And so they spoke, to each other, to the guards, to anyone who would carry their voices upward. But voices have a difficult journey, especially when they must travel toward a man who has already decided he knows enough. The man who entered the palace carried those voices, not loudly, not with force, but with clarity. He had seen the land. He had walked the fields. He had felt what others were beginning to fear, but the king had not. Because distance creates illusion, and comfort creates silence. The king believed his kingdom was strong, because from where he sat, nothing appeared broken. And so the man stood before him, not as a challenger, not as an enemy, but as something far more difficult to accept. A mirror, a reflection of truth the king had avoided. But truth, when it arrives quietly, is often ignored. And so it was. The man's presence did not create change. It revealed resistance. The king remained still, unmoved, certain in a way that only those untouched by consequence can be. And beyond the palace, the kingdom continued to shift. The seasons did not follow their usual pattern. Rain came late, and when it came, it did not stay. The ground hardened, crops struggled, and slowly the whispers turned into concern. But concern without leadership becomes confusion, and confusion spreads. The people waited for direction, for assurance, for something that would tell them they had not been forgotten. But the palace remained quiet, because a king who does not listen often does not speak when it matters. Time moved forward, as it always does, without pause, without permission, and with it came consequence. The rivers grew thinner, the soil lost its strength, and what had once been a kingdom of abundance began to resemble something else. Not failure, not yet, but fragility, the kind that is easy to ignore until it isn't. Inside the palace, nothing had changed. The king still believed in his control, still believed in his understanding, still believed that silence meant stability. But silence is not always peace. Sometimes it is neglect. The man who had entered the palace remained, not in position, not in power, but in presence. Because some truths do not leave when they are ignored. They wait. And as the kingdom weakened, the weight of what had been dismissed began to grow. Food became scarce, water became uncertain, and the people began to lose something deeper than resources: trust. And the king began to notice, not through listening, but through impact. Empty spaces where there should have been life. Quiet where there should have been activity. For the first time, something within him shifted. Not understanding, but discomfort. And discomfort is often the beginning of awareness. But awareness, delayed, carries a cost. By the time the king chose to look beyond his throne, the damage had already begun. The man who entered the palace had seen it from the beginning. But truth, offered too early, is often rejected. Now it stood undeniable. The king walked through parts of his kingdom he had not seen in years, not because he chose to, but because he had no choice left. And what he saw was not what he believed he ruled. He saw struggle. He saw absence. He saw the result of decisions made without listening. And for the first time, the silence around him felt different. And as the king stood within the reality he had ignored, he understood something that could not be undone. That power without listening is not strength, it is isolation. And isolation blinds. The kingdom did not collapse in a single moment. It faded, piece by piece, until what remained was not what had been. The man who had entered the palace was no longer needed to speak, because the truth he carried had already unfolded. And the king, who had once believed he knew enough, now understood something far more difficult, that knowing is not the same as listening. And by the time he learned the difference, it was too late. Because some lessons do not arrive to guide, they arrive to reveal. And what they reveal cannot always be changed. This story reveals a quiet truth about life. Wisdom does not come from power, experience, or position alone. It comes from the willingness to listen to others, to change, and to the signs that something is not right. When a person stops listening, they stop growing, and when growth stops, decline quietly begins. It also shows that silence is not always a sign that everything is fine. Sometimes people stop speaking not because they have nothing to say, but because they believe they are not being heard. Watch, like, comment, and subscribe on my channel, Motivated by Stories, on YouTube, for more stories like this.